Okay, well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the second Religious Studies lecture of the fall semester. My name is Louis Stolman, and on behalf of the Religious Studies and Philosophy faculty, we're really happy you're here. Even if even if it's compulsion, we're still happy you're here. The first lecture, which some of you attended, was on Judaism and vocation. And we focused on the Hebrew word tikkun olam, which is the Hebrew word for healing a broken world. Tonight's lecture is on Christianity and vocation and will be given by Dr. Brent Sleasman. Before I introduce him, let me just say something about the format this evening, which is just very simple. Brent will be speaking for 3 hours, and then we'll have a Q&A. Okay, how about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. So I knew they'd wake up somehow. Okay, so by 8:15 we'll be on our way, and you can study or do whatever else for the evening. Excuse me? Oh, okay. Okay. So I would ask you to, I'd also remind you to please silence your cell phones. And now let me just introduce Dr. Sleasman. First of all, he is an alum of the University of Findlay. Majored in communications. He graduated from Winebrenner with an MDiv. He has a Ph.D. in rhetoric from Duquesne University. And before returning to Findlay as the president of Winebrenner Theological Seminary, Pastor Sleasman was the associate professor in the School of Communication at Gannon University in Erie, Pennsylvania. He is also an author, an editor, a speaker, as I mentioned, a pastor in the Churches of God. And I guess his claim to fame is that he survived my classes as a student. So to me, he's all that and actually more. He's a really good friend, a dear friend, and it's an honor to have him here this evening. So let's give him a University of Findlay welcome.
It's good to be here this evening, and so I know the risk of an evening like this. Somebody help me out. Are you here because you want to be? Yeah. Is this for extra credit or is it required? Required. All right. So here's my thought on that, and I'm channeling my classroom instructor days. Because you have to be here, all I have to be is just slightly better than mediocre, because you've got to be here. So that really takes the pressure off as far as any expectation. But I'm hoping that the time together tonight can be useful to you in your courses, and at least several of you will be able to leave tonight and think that, yes, I had to be here, but what we were able to think about and talk about was worthwhile. As Dr. Stolman said, I was one of his students, and for many of you who have had Dr. Stolman, I remember I was a Winebrenner student and still finishing a few courses at the University of Findlay, and I stopped at his office door, and he asked me, "How are you doing?" And I just recall thinking, does he really care about me? And for those of you who have had Dr. Stolman, I had Dr. Brocker also, the sincere realization and the challenge was, yes, he genuinely did care how I was doing. We had a good conversation. You probably have no memory of that moment, but I remember at that point just being overwhelmed that a faculty member, a respected faculty member, would actually care that much about students. And it wasn't just a reflection of his caring for me, but also the care he takes with the work. And so it's a privilege to be here for the other faculty and the other staff as well to be part of this session tonight. And so you have a handout that you should have gotten. There's a few others floating around if you hadn't. This isn't something anybody's going to collect. I'm breaking one of the main rules for many who lecture and talk. There's no presentation. There's no PowerPoint slides. For those of you that think it's a requirement for a presentation, I'm violating that. But for this evening, I did want to give you something just to be able to process through. For those of you who want to doodle, there's nothing on the back. For those of you who like to fill in the blanks, I'll be sure that I give you all the information. But my hope is if there is something that you need to write about or reflect upon after tonight, the sheet is simply to be a guide to help you think through some of the things that I'm going to talk about and share. So my intention is to be done by 7:45 with my presentation, and then we'll have time for questions as well, and hopefully some answers that are helpful to you. And so if you want to write any of those down, hang on to those, and I'll be glad to share as we get to that point. And so I want to begin and Dr. Sleasman provided just a little bit of biographical information, but the point for this evening is to think about vocation from a Christian perspective. And so I work from what would be considered an evangelical Christian perspective, and I'll define that and give you a little bit more direction what that means before I'm done tonight. But I want to do just what I'd call an extended introduction, and think about my life in really what I'd call three movements that help clarify and raise some themes related to what it means to be an evangelical Christian and how that's different perhaps from Catholicism, from other strands of Protestantism, from Eastern Orthodoxy, Anabaptism. And if these words don't mean anything to you, hopefully they will before we're done tonight. So I was born in Southwest Pennsylvania. Any Pennsylvania people here tonight? All right. You're not that enthused by it? That's okay. So about an hour southeast of Pittsburgh. And so you see on your paper there that those first two words, it says culture versus faith. And I want to think about the first movement of my life very simply, that culture informed my faith. That it was an inherited faith that I grew up, it was a Christian home that I was born into, and I'm sure some of you here identify with that, and others of you here have no idea what that means, and that's okay on either side. But I grew up in very much a culture-informed faith of something that I inherited. And when I say culture-informed faith, really what I'm thinking about here is that my world was organized, my world organized how I live my faith. And so it was very much a cultural. So that lasted probably from when I was born up until I was 22, 23 years old. And so that even impacted when I came to the University of Findlay, whenever I attended Winebrenner Seminary. And so about the age of 16, I had, and this is not uncommon within the strand of evangelical Christianity, what some might call a, quote, call to ministry. And so what that simply means is I felt something stirring that made me think maybe God was challenging me to pursue a life, in this case a life of vocation, that might in fact lead to some kind of work within the church, a missionary context, and so on. And that made a lot of sense within the culture that I grew up. But I do remember we had a guest speaker at the church where I grew up. And for those of you familiar with Southwest Pennsylvania, I was about 10-15 minutes from Seventh Spring Ski Resort. And so we had a guest speaker at church, and that was the first time anyone publicly from the pulpit of the church stood and said, well, Brent's in the congregation, and he's feeling called perhaps to serve as a pastor. And I remember the girl that I was dating at that time taking her home from something a few days later, and she also attended that church. And it was that moment she looked, and I remember very distinctly, I'm driving, and she said, so you want to be a pastor? And so in that context, while it wasn't uncommon that most pastors came from that environment, people were called out, there was still that sense of, pastors are kind of weird people. They're different, they're weird. And she wasn't sure, I'm not sure if that was what caused it, but it wasn't more than a few months later than it was a girl I used to date. And it was just one of those factors, but for her, that was just something that was really odd at that point. So that was probably around age 16 that I felt that personal experience in which I felt that God was calling me to do something, quote, for Him, but it was still definitely culture was informing. So even with that call, when I say that culture was informing, as soon as I felt that call to ministry, what it meant in that moment for me was that I had to be a pastor, that I had to serve within the Churches of God General Conference, that I had to return to Western Pennsylvania, and that's just what I had to do. That all the cultural assumptions that were loaded into that sense of call to ministry just happened simultaneously. So in a lot of ways, I just felt like my life had been planned completely from the moment when I was about 16. So it was still culture forming my faith and not the other way around. So I attended Winebrenner following my graduation from the University of Findlay. And so that really was the conclusion of what I'd call that first movement where culture informed my faith. Probably from the time I was about 23 till I was about 35. So for about a decade of my life, I would just say that I lived in this moment where culture and faith were in conflict. That I had multiple struggles trying to make sense. Both by that point I was married, we had a daughter, and I'll get into more of how our family grew from there. But it was a case of this culture and faith in conflict. And this is even, I was serving as a pastor. I served at West Independence United Methodist Church out on 224. For those of you that drive toward Tiffin, that's just like a mile past Enon Valley. At least when I was here, that's where the policemen used to sit if you were going fast on 224. But West Independence is just a little bit further out. I went to Duquesne University, completed a Ph.D. in rhetoric, and then served as a pastor, and then moved into full-time higher education. But during this era of my life, there was still faith and culture in conflict. And so my guess is that's where a lot of you would find yourself. And so as you take a look there under culture versus faith, I just have it written that my life in blank number of movements. Again, nobody's collecting this. I'm not trying to convert you. I'm not trying to preach to you. I just simply wanted to give you something to be thinking about. If you were going to use these categories of culture versus faith, whatever faith position you would have, are there natural divisions and natural places that you would break that down and think about it? You don't have to use my categories. It's just something for you to be thinking about. I recall, though, in this faith and culture, because I think sometimes we get these things slightly confused. When I was teaching an intercultural communication class at Gannon University, I remember one student, a female student from the Buffalo, New York area, we were talking about identity. And she raised her hand and she said, "I'm completely opposite from my family. I am my own person." And I said, "Okay, well, that's interesting. Say a little bit more." And she said, "Well, my parents are Republicans. I'm a Democrat. My parents dress conservatively. Look how I dress." And it was a bit more flamboyant. She said, "Their mouths are clean and I swear like whatever." And she had this 3 or 4 things in addition that she said, "My parents and family do this, but I do something else." And her closing comment was, "I'm my own person." Now, if we were honest, my guess is, again, there are several here that would say, "That's me." Well, here's what I told this student, and she didn't like it. I said, "So you're saying that whatever your parents are, you're the opposite?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Well, then your parents are defining your identity, not you. Because you've defined yourself in complete opposition to who your parents are." And for her, there was a religious component there. And so this whole idea of identity, it's much more complicated than just saying you're this, I'm that. Because if that's your position, all you're doing is letting the other person define who you are. And so in this idea of faith and culture and conflict, it's much more complicated, but I lived there probably for about 10 years until about I was 35 or so. And then around this, and that's a rough estimate of an age. I would say my wife and I together moved into a third movement when I would say my faith began to form my understanding of culture. And my faith became something primary. I'm not saying that to elevate myself. I'm not saying that at some point I couldn't revert to a place where culture, and it's still a struggle, but I know that as we've progressed and moved through, some would call it spiritual maturity, some would call it a factor of spiritual discipline. For us, it's just by God's grace that we're to a point. And so that's where actions begin to flow out of your faith, even when they might not conform to what the world might expect. So the way that took form in our lives, so our youngest 2 children are adopted from Haiti. And so it was around 2010, 2011. I'm 43. I'll be 44 next month, for those of you trying to do the math, not that anybody cares. So this has been now about 8 or 9 years in this era as well. But we were at this church service, church we attended, and they had a day dedicated to Haiti. We had been in the domestic adoption process, and that's its own story. And so we went home that day, we got talking, and the next thing that happens, we are in the process of adopting 2 children from Haiti. And so we have a 12-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a soon-to-be 8-year-old. Our youngest are, again, we're born in Haiti. It's been 5 years since our family's been together. But when you try to explain that, and many of you, maybe you're adopted, maybe you have siblings that are adopted, you're even thinking someday, I'd like to adopt. Try to explain to someone who's driven by cultural assumptions of financial success, of flexibility with family, that you're investing a significant amount of money, what many people could make as a down payment on a beautiful home, and you're taking that money and investing so that you can provide a life and a family for children. And so we don't feel that that's anything we should be elevated for. I'm sharing it in this context simply as a reflection that as our life has gone through its stages, our faith began to inform our understanding of culture and the actions that we should take. So our faith became much more personal. And then out of that, in December of 2015, the opportunity presented itself, and I became president at Winebrenner, the position that I'm in now. And so just 2 final comments on this extended introduction, and then I want to get to some themes within some of these different religions. I would say when that culture informed my faith, my first job was at Ohio Bank, which then became Sky Bank, which then became Huntington Bank here in Findlay. I never had a real job till I came to the University of Findlay, and I worked as a bank teller for a year. But I definitely, in that era where the culture informed my faith, I worked to earn money. I had a sense that God was providing. I had a sense that my work was important. But ultimately, if you said, hey, why are you working? I'm working to pay my bills. There was no sense it depends on how you define vocation, but there wasn't any sense that my work was important in and of itself. I worked to make money so I could eat. And that was a key item. And so the transition at this point, and if you ask me that same question, why do I work now? I think about the money that I earn now allows us to do good work. That ultimately a shift that I've made and our family has made is, yes, do you need money to survive? Absolutely. However, from a vocational standpoint or from just a faith perspective, I don't work to make money. I believe that God will provide, and I believe the money that we have, though, that I earn allows us to do good work. Now, I want to be clear. For some, that's a really privileged idea. We've spent a lot of time in Haiti, for example, and for anyone who's ever traveled, anybody here that comes from a position of poverty, I don't say that out of disrespect because I understand that there are some that might be thinking, or people who watch this later might think it's really easy for someone who has an academic administrator position to say things like that. And I can't change who I am or the position I'm in, but even with limited resources, and we've had seasons in our life where there have been more limited than it may seem, we can still think about that idea of vocation. And I think working from a Christian perspective, the money that I earn allows us to do good work. That's not an issue of how much you make, but it's an issue of disposition and thought in relation to what it is that you have and what you make. So as I said, I'm an evangelical Christian. Evangelicalism, here briefly, is a branch of Protestant Christianity, and this is where a graph would be helpful, but I think I can do this pretty clearly. Within the realm of Christianity, I'm going to just break it down pretty simply in 3 categories. You have Protestant Christianity, you have Catholicism, and you have Eastern Orthodoxy. Some of you may have talked about some of this in your classes. Some would consider a 4th category Anabaptism. And so if that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. Again, I'm not testing you on this stuff. You don't need to pass a test to get into heaven, so don't worry about it. But just to broadly, though, Protestantism grew out of Roman Catholicism. And Protestantism, in that term, is the word protest. So Protestantism traces its roots back to the first century, the time of Jesus, and about 1,000 years ago, these are really rough numbers, the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church split over some differences. And about 500 years ago, Protestantism grew out of Roman Catholicism. And so I come from that strand of Protestantism that would be considered evangelicalism, and that has greatly informed my faith. And so growing up, I didn't really have that much understanding that I even had a faith position. Again, it was defined by the culture. I knew on a Sunday morning, we lived in a neighborhood, there were probably 15 houses, that everybody would get up and drive to the left on Sunday morning, except for one house, and they got up and drove to the right. And it took me years to know why they did that. Well, it turns out they were Catholic. Their church was a different place. Everybody else went to our evangelical Protestant church, and it was just a matter of geography. But I associated a lot of things just because, oh, they're Catholic. Well, that means they go, and things that just weren't true and not always helpful. But the challenge is there are people here that have, however many people, who have a variety of different perspectives. And so take the time to learn before we draw conclusions and so on. So I want to talk about my particular faith tradition and then contrast it with some of the others. And if you're in the evangelical Christianity camp, then this will make more sense to you, hopefully. Perhaps it'll draw some, it'll give you a sense of a few items for your own faith. And for those of you who aren't in the evangelical Christianity camp, it might give you a point of reference to learn about some differences. So there's a scholar, his name is David Bebbington. David Bebbington. And so if you have your paper there and if you are trying to fill out, we're just going to talk about 4 themes of evangelicalism. And if you're not sure how to spell it, it's not a big deal. It's really spelled how it sounds. It's not like it's supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, but evangelicalism, do your best to spell it, but those 4 themes. And David Bebbington is a British scholar. He's a British historian, religious scholar, and he talks about these 4 factors. I think they're helpful factors to define evangelicalism. And the first one is the role of the Bible. And so just to bring a good visual aid, this is the Bible that I still use. I got it when I graduated high school in 1993. And so it's aging a little bit. So it's falling apart, mostly from use, but partly due to age. We all reach a point where we just get old. So that's what I feel like. So the role of the Bible, and so thinking about evangelicalism, immediately, if you find yourself in that camp, or if you find yourself talking to an evangelical, and let me just say the disclaimer here, this term evangelical is used quite a bit in politics, and that is not my source of definition. And so in the United States especially, there's a lot of conversation about our current president and about how evangelicals, and so part of this may just be a counterbalance to how other sources, the media, folks that you know may define that. And again, this isn't about an evangelical sense of vocation, it's a Christian sense of vocation, but I'm respectful that I can only talk most completely from my own position and using this as a point to compare some other things. So evangelicalism places a high priority on the Bible. And so one of the challenges within evangelicalism, a lot of times the conversation, well, what does the Bible say about that? Now, in contrast to, say, Roman Catholicism, where you'll hear from time to time, somebody may say within evangelicalism, this is my only source of faith and practice. And it depends on the churches. If anybody here goes to a church, you may have someone who talks about anything other than the Bible. Your phrases like, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That phrase honestly drives me insane because I think it misses a lot of the points about the role of the Bible and Scripture. But there are folks that sometimes even misprioritize this. But the Bible for an evangelical is the highest priority. And so say within Roman Catholicism, there's a counterbalance with the role of tradition, with the words of church leaders. It doesn't mean the Bible is unimportant. Some faith traditions talk about in terms of Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. But even with some using that quadrilateral, there'd be some who would say, well, that the Bible's no. And there's probably someone here, and I'm not making light of this at all, but someone here is probably saying, no, it's not Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. It's not the voices of the church leaders. It's only this. And that's because they come from a tradition known as evangelicalism that prioritizes the words of Scripture. The one item that I would think about in terms of that, and the challenge if you would find yourself in that camp, these words need to be interpreted. No words, and the Bible included, interpret themselves. And so the challenge becomes a lot of times what's called proof texting, or taking the language of Scripture or the Bible and simply saying, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Well, we need to keep in mind that this book, 2,000 years old or older, translated, the language of evangelicals will say that the Holy Spirit helps you interpret. However, this doesn't interpret itself. Now, a second theme of evangelicalism is the role of Jesus. And so when we think about Jesus, if you ever had a Bible, and if you ever saw one before, sometimes in the New Testament, the words are in red letters. The words that Jesus said are in red letters. I had a friend when I was a student at the University of Findlay, was always annoyed by that because she would say, well, that's kind of like when you go get a car and you ask, does it have air conditioning? I feel like it's an upgrade on a Bible. Like somehow if you get the Bible that doesn't have the red letters, you got a lesser version. And so, different people have different opinions, but the red letters are intended to highlight the words of Jesus. The challenge is, and this is a risk of evangelicalism, is that Jesus is reduced to the words on the page, and we forget that he's actually a person. And so even the way that I've talked about this and sharing with other people, the way that it informs our faith, Jesus is a person, not words on a page. And so the challenge within some, and depends on conservative and where they're at, that's a challenge to think about Jesus as a person as opposed to exclusively the words. Now, a way that in some camps it's called a sacrament, in some it's called communion, but I brought this little home communion kit from when I served as a pastor. And so if you've ever been in a church service, maybe they take communion where they celebrate the blood through perhaps the wine. Some people will spend an hour just talking about it wasn't wine, it's grape juice. What a waste of time. The Bible says wine, it's okay. The first time we went to Haiti, our oldest daughter at that point probably was 9, and so we took communion. Wine's much cheaper than grape juice, and so our 9-year-old is taking communion in Haiti. She looks at us, kind of squinches her face and says, "What is that?" We take communion. Yeah, she's had alcohol. So, there are family members that I have that would be very troubled by that. But thinking about communion, it's a celebration and a remembrance of who Jesus is, and so the priority of the role of Jesus. A third theme of evangelicalism is the priority of personal conversion. This idea, so if you are familiar at all with evangelicalism, and this is we're coming back now into the idea of vocation. We took a little detour, we're coming back into that now. The priority of personal conversion and a general belief that conversion's a good thing. So you start with this idea. If you're familiar at all with 12-step programs, they start from they're faith-informed from a Christian perspective. That idea of you've got to hit rock bottom, that idea that there's sin in the world, and so what that causes is a need to be converted. You need to turn from that life. You need to give up your former life, your former beliefs, to become something else. And so this is where then, within evangelicalism, you get a sense and people start talking about serving as a pastor. Maybe people serve as a missionary, and these are roles that are expressions of one's faith, but also are tied very closely to one's faith as an effort to help others come to know the faith. Within the Catholic Church, there are priests. Within other Christian faith traditions, sometimes they're called priests, sometimes they're called pastors, sometimes church leaders. I mean, you can go through in a variety, but there's in a church community, in a church context, in a parish context, there's someone who's been designated to serve in that capacity. And a lot of times, for a lot of people, this is where it's not 4 themes of evangelicalism, it's 3, and the only valid roles then are those who serve in churches and those who serve as missionaries, and it depends on your experience. That may be your sense of vocation from a Christian perspective, is the only person that has any kind of vocation is someone who's serving as a pastor, a priest, or some kind of missionary in that context. And that's why one of the reasons I like Bebbington's framework he talks then about a fourth theme of evangelicalism, and that is people who are active in their faith. So the four themes of evangelicalism: the role of the Bible, the role of Jesus, priority of personal conversion, and active in faith. And so it's people who then say, okay, this is something that I believe, something that is informing who I am, and I need to carry that out in a public setting. So it was sometime in the 1970s, early 1980s, and I'll use the word hijacked intentionally, that the Republican Party was hijacked by a very conservative religious perspective. I would consider myself to be fairly moderate or conservative, so I'm speaking somewhat here from my own perspective. So nobody take offense. I'm not calling out someone who you don't veer that much different, but there was a hijack or a takeover, and so in our country, in the United States, there's very much a confusion about what it means to be a Republican and what it means to be an evangelical Christian. And I'm not going to turn this into a political commentary, but simply to point out that if we talk about these four themes of evangelicalism, being active in the faith does not mean voting Republican. And sadly, a lot of people have missed Bebbington's and others' points, and that's how they've defined what it means to be active in their faith. And so this is where I think to reflect for a few moments on the University of Findlay and this idea of meaningful lives and productive careers, thinking theologically about life and work. This is the place that I really think the University of Findlay has set itself up to succeed and has set you up to succeed, whether you're working from a Christian perspective or not. But for those of you who are, I think this idea of meaningful lives and productive careers, Bebbington's understanding of evangelicalism, and broadly speaking, Christianity in general, has a public dimension, has an element that you need to carry that faith out regardless of where you fall on the Christian spectrum. And this brings us right back to this notion of vocation. And so what I would think about here is just this idea, words that Winebrenner that we would use is really about kingdom orientation, being about God's kingdom and not just about the work of the church. And so for a few moments, I want to think about some of the majors represented here. I'm sure I was a College of Liberal Arts student, so I'm sure there may be some religion students, philosophy students, English students, communication, public relations, and you might have no desire to serve in any capacity in a church or religious context. That's okay. You can have a meaningful life and productive career. You can have a very holistic sense of vocation from a Christian perspective. And what I would argue is that you're working from a kingdom perspective that respects that God is working. And one thing about Christianity is that there is God, there is Jesus, Christ that's where Christianity comes from. And so we're on safe ground thinking about that from a Christian perspective. But it doesn't matter whether you're a physical therapist, whether you're working in public relations, whether you're in business, whether you're a stay-at-home parent, you can have a meaningful life and a productive career, and you can have a holistic sense of vocation working from a Christian perspective in any of those fields. You don't exclusively have to be working in a church, a nonprofit, or in some faith-informed perspective. So it's not just about working or being involved in a church, but it's about carrying out God's work in various aspects. And so we think about for a moment a meaningful life and productive career. I want to think also here for a few moments about what it means to have a meaningful life. So a lot of times we have, and maybe this is something from my era, I've learned a long time ago not to try to talk like a generation I'm not. And so maybe this is just a reflection, but this whole idea of people might try to find themselves, and they need to take some time, and they need to find themselves, and that's maybe a 20-year-old or so phrase. But a lot of times then what that really meant was somebody was pursuing meaning. My life lacks meaning, so I'm just going to go to try to find something meaningful. And the irony of that is they usually don't find something meaningful. If you're chasing something like meaning, what are you doing? I'm just trying to do something meaningful. It's probably going to be a dead end. And so I would think about trying to find what I would say would be meaningful stories, meaningful organizations, things that you look at, volunteer organizations. Maybe it is a church, maybe it's a student group, maybe it's some organization, maybe it's a family tradition, something that has meaning because it continues, it's a tradition. More of the philosophical term might be it has a certain narrative that goes with it, and you join it, you become a character in a story, and by becoming a character in a story, that gives your life meaning. And vocation, and my understanding of vocation in this context, is pursuing something because it's meaningful is good, but a lot of times those become dead ends. And so as you think about this, the sheet, we're talking about culture versus faith, thinking about your life in a few movements, providing those 4 themes of evangelicalism, that I am a/and, that's simply, I just situated myself here that I'm an evangelical Christian. The one challenge that I would have is if you look at that and say, I have no idea. I'm not concerned, and I'm not here tonight to tell you what the answer for that blank should be. But I would suggest that at some point, especially during your undergraduate years, if not this semester, if not this week, that you can at least have an answer for that now. How would you define yourself? And maybe you can only define yourself by something you know you're not. And that's okay. But at least don't just walk away saying, I don't know, and be content with that. And then that final question on the bottom, what does it mean to have a meaningful life and productive career from a Christian perspective? And how can you go about having a vocation, a sense of a vocation? And so with that, I just want us to think about here as we wrap up that you don't have to serve as a pastor, you don't have to serve as a missionary, but you can have a meaningful life and productive career being about God's business in God's kingdom, working from a Christian perspective, and having a sense of vocation wherever you find yourself. And so I want to go ahead and I'm going to conclude with that for my comments. We've got plenty of time for questions. Feel free to challenge. Feel free to share an idea. Feel free to raise a question. It's a privilege to be here tonight, and I want to make this as meaningful and useful to you as well. So faculty, staff, students, feel free, but that concludes the formal part of the presentation. The question was, if you're in a place, and I'm going to make a couple assumptions, working from a Christian perspective, you find yourself in a place that you really don't feel meaningful, but we're not God. And so the tension between, am I here for a reason or... And so I want to unpack just for a moment to provide a context. Within evangelicalism, there's 2, and you don't have to get the words, but there's 2 very strong and very different camps. One would be more of a Reformed camp. One would be more of an Arminian. And really the core issue here is the issue of free will. And so I work from more of the free will side, the Arminian side. So because there would be some on the Reformed side that the answer may be, this is not my answer, but the answer may be, yes, God put you there. God put you there for a reason. And until you either feel released from that, you have something to learn or they have something to learn, but you're there for a reason. Go get them. I find that unsatisfactory, not that motivating. And so, but in some ways, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, it's a little simpler, no less complex, but a little simpler in the sense that it releases, I have to struggle with this. I'm more in the struggle camp, and my question would be your question in terms of, okay, how do we know? We're in the process of buying a home, and we've rented for about 10 years. and that's its own story, but we're in the process, and we have gone through that question repeatedly. How do we know? We've done this for 10 years. Why now? We could easily walk away. And the answer, I think a key part, a couple try to be concrete with the answer. One, I think, working from my perspective, my answer would be, I think there is something to be said for the stirring in our spirit. That, do I feel like, is it a sense of release? There is a feeling component to it. Second, the affirmation of other people. That Proverbs talks about, to grow wise, we should walk with the wise. And so I think really seeking out a circle of people who could provide insight. And so, less my answer, if that's your real life situation, I would think about the question, who are 2 or 3 people that I have deep trust in, that may be a little bit further down the road? And in some cases, parents aren't always, because we have 3 kids, parents have conflicted answers for things. But people who can have a sense of objectivity and may be able to collaboratively say, look, here's what I'm struggling with. You know my situation. Can you speak into this and maybe provide some guidance for me? But I do think, having said that, I do think there are opportunities to learn. Life, and this is easier said when you're older, life has seasons. And so the Israelites walked in the desert for 40 years, and there will be seasons of life that feel like that. And their temptation constantly was to go back to Egypt because the belief was it was better there. And if anyone's here a fan of VeggieTales, you know, somebody said, but we were in slavery, you know, that idea. And sometimes we miss, so that phrase, the grass is always greener. But I think we can learn from things. I think God's always at work. But I would seek out 2 or 3 people that I trust deeply and say, can you help me with this? And ultimately, it just comes down to making a decision. And but some seasons we do find ourselves in something unsatisfactory. And then the question is, what can we learn from that? Yeah. Is that another question?
I was kind of thinking about more or less about what you're saying about everyone has a role in society, so either not depending on, but fast food, your whole life, a career or starting some type of so it could go on, kind of like a lower end career sort of thing. You think they would find
Absolutely, and I appreciate how you're asking that question, and I think that gets to the heart of when I talk about culture versus faith, because culturally, and I'll use the phrase you use, there's no question that culturally, someone who works at McDonald's is lower than, say, an exec at Marathon. One of the most defining moments in my own awareness about this idea of vocation came from, it was probably about 4 or 5 years ago. We were in Erie, Pennsylvania. We didn't live there anymore. We were passing through. We stayed at a hotel. We were on our way to church. We stopped at McDonald's on a Sunday morning, and there was a manager who had an incredible amount of patience that exceeded anything I could have with the staff she was working with. And I just remember having this profound sense, and this is part of that spirit stirring, standing, watching the patience that she had with these, and they were high school age guys. Sorry guys, we're doofuses around that age. That's just, hopefully we grow out of it. I may not have, but that's life. But I watched the immense patience that she had with those, and it struck me in that moment, because we're on our way to church, that she has as much or more influence over the formation of those guys than youth leaders, than pastors, than parents, because she's probably spending 8 hours a day. And if somebody could look at her, and I was having this driving away, so it wasn't me. We didn't have that profound moment where, you know, the music started and I told her this. But if somebody could look at her and say, do you understand in your role at McDonald's that culture would tell you has limited meaning? You probably don't get paid as much as you want. You work horrible hours, and the food after a while just wears on you. But you have the ability to invest in these people and give them meaning in a way. So I think part of it is, how do we carry ourselves? And in those seasons, you're on the front lines. You're on the front lines of kingdom work in that capacity in every industry that you mentioned. has the ability to give meaning to somebody else and to do it in a way that's God-honoring and working from a sense of vocation, because it's culture that tells us. It is culture that tells us, not Scripture, not our faith, that those jobs are lower in terms of meaning. And so if we won't, other than this comment, if you take a look at the Bible, the people Jesus spent time with are exactly the people that you mentioned. And culture gets that wrong. And I don't mean to be trite, but if it was good enough for Jesus in that sense, we should pay attention to it as well. But yeah, excellent questions.
You mentioned that, like when you were thinking about the call and ministry, everything seems to be like planned out for you. But then like another note, we see a lot of like second career pastors. Do you think those two things like confuse each other? That it seems like the only thing you can do when you're doing a call is become a pastor, so a lot of like younger folks kind of get turned off by that and then push it off and more into the gym?
Yeah, and I didn't tell the rest of the story, so I appreciate the question. When I had that sense of call at 16, all the things to me that implied that I would serve as a pastor, I would go to Winebrenner, I would return to Pennsylvania, and that pretty much would be it. I went to Winebrenner, and I've spent time in Pennsylvania. Sorry, it makes it sound like prison. I spent some years in Pennsylvania, but I'm not currently serving as a pastor, and I don't currently live in Pennsylvania. Much to the dismay of my family, mainly because it's flat here. We love Findlay, other than it's just somewhat too flat. And if you're ever around me much, I'll probably say that again, because it's just too flat. So for my own, to personalize it for a moment, I would go as far as a crisis of faith. It was my third year at Winebrenner, in a course that I was taking, preparing to become a pastor, that cultural expectation got shattered. And so it was a struggle for a while to figure out, but I had all this figured out. I had it figured out. And when it blew up, there was several months that life was just confusing. And that's really, that's why I would mark about 23, because the pivot point from, realizing that culture can't define who I am. So yeah, I think, second career, partly, there are life factors at times that there's no question. I was single at that point. Folks that are single or even in a non-deeply committed relationship, it's much easier to spend a year or two in another geographic location. But life begins to add obligations, relationships, bills, health issues maybe for family members. And so there's a reason why it takes a while for many to get to a point in life. So mid-career, a lot of times, is when we begin to get a little bit of control on that. And that's not dishonoring God, but yeah, there are times that it just takes a while to work through some of those things. Does that answer?
Yeah, I guess like do you think there are ways that we can handle it better, like to sort of advertise that there is more we can do? Because I think a lot of younger folks enjoy ministry and things like that. But when it's like kind of putting away that your whole life is made out for you kids, that's like, are we really showing them what it's about?
Yeah, so there's he's an author, speaker, Reggie McNeil, and that I've had the benefit of spending time with, and he talks a lot about this. And the idea, I think in a lot of ways, is the church, the evangelical church especially, is in some ways on this point its own worst enemy. And so how we define church, what church is, a lot of times, even the idea, and I've had conversations, I'll use Winebrenner for an example, but people think that we only offer education to train pastors, which is entirely untrue, but that perception exists. And if you dig a little deeper, there are those then, and how does that play out? Well, there are times then when we'll have students who will talk about pastors' wives. And so why do they say, well, pastors' wives? Because they're assuming that if you're going to be a pastor, you're a man and you're married. And yet we've been open to women as students, and we've even had staff members who have said things like that. And I want to pull my hair out, because Do you understand all the assumptions you're making that just reinforce the very point you're raising? So yeah, are there things that we could do better? Absolutely. I think a starting point is to talk about a kingdom orientation versus a church orientation and just reaffirm, but there are cultural barriers. The issue of privilege. And in some camps, that's a loaded term, and I'm not trying to get into that, but there are things within white evangelicalism that I have a privileged position, a middle-aged white male, and it's very easy for me to just assume that anyone who's not like me doesn't factor in. And so, yeah, we do a lot of things that are a disservice that we could do a lot better on as well. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's so. Before I answer that, are you East Coast? Because I see the Yankees in Villanova. I mean, so you're a Yankees fan? You just like the hat? Okay. Okay. You're not a Patriots fan, are you? Okay. All right. So I can. I'm a Steelers fan. So sorry. That's all right. Yeah, we're good. We're good. So if I could, so everyone could hear the question, then the idea is basically is Christianity is really the call to transform the culture or just to exist in the culture? Yeah. And that's, so I would say that Scripture teaches that we're to be in the world, not of the world. I'm going to take a huge risk here and tell a story about something that's happening. It's not a risk for me, but it just, I think it illustrates this point, and it's something that's, so the University of Findlay the University of Findlay sold the building that we're in to the, let me back up here. Winebrenner Theological Seminary sold the building over on 950 North Main Street to the University of Findlay last April. So, I mean, most people know, many people thought the university owned it already. So that's not the risky part here. So I need to set that up as a context, and then this is all in part to answer this question. And so the University of Findlay owns the building. And so every summer, for those of you familiar with the Mazza Gallery, they have a conference that takes place. And so the Mazza Museum had a conference in June. And so as part of that conference, there was a breakout session for children's books for the LGBTQIA plus community. And that breakout session took place on the second floor in the Winebrenner building. To be clear, Winebrenner, we have no influence. We don't own the building. We don't have any say over what goes on in that facility. And so that conference was taking place, and that breakout session was being held. Simultaneous to that breakout session, there was a week intensive course, W-E-E-K, not W-E-A-K, a week-long intensive course for Winebrenner taking place on the second floor across the hall. Now, some of you who come from this particular evangelical conservative camp already can see the collision coming. We had a student who was in that class who saw that sign for that breakout session, and immediately, this was on a Tuesday of that week, immediately packed up and went home to Pennsylvania. And I've been having conversations and phone calls ever since. And so I offer that story, and I'll say a little bit more, but I think that question for many, there is a culture war, and I'm not taking sides on that. I can tell you what my position is and how I've responded, and then others can respond. My answer to that issue, because I like to think in concrete terms, not abstract. So I want to give that scenario. My answer, I respect the student that left. I have a deep respect for the church he comes from. I've gone to the church. I've spoken with the leadership. I have a deep appreciation for their desire to be God-honoring. But I think the response has missed the mark. We're called to be in the world, not of the world. And anytime you look at Scripture, light penetrates darkness. Darkness doesn't penetrate light. And so if you even take a look, and the allegory here is that light would come from Jesus Christ, darkness would be evil. If you take a look at this room and you even see where the shadows are cast, the light moves into the dark, but the dark doesn't make the rest of the room dark, because dark is the absence of light. And so my case was, if you are of the belief that a particular gender or sexual perspective is not consistent with your faith perspective, then my question is, wouldn't you then believe that we should be together so that the light and the truth of the perspective could be shared? Others, though, and the student that left was of the belief that this is a direct violation of God's word. We should be separate completely. There's no business that this is taking place in that building, and so we need to be separate. So there would be, to be fair, if we're thinking about the Christian perspective, you would find answers to your question all over the spectrum. My particular answer might not be as far as gracious as some. However, my belief would be there was nothing violating the integrity of Winebrenner or of the building with that event taking place. And so itself has become a bit of a conversation point for some. So I believe that part of our call as Christians is to transform the world. And so I believe that we can be in the world, we're not of the world. What that simply means, from my vantage point, staying with the language, is that my faith should form my understanding of culture, not the other way around. Yeah. Yeah, and you can't be a lawbreaker. If we think about the Ten Commandments as a law, you can't, or let me ask you this question: can you be a lawbreaker before the law is given? And that's, and so I think the idea that could there be another divine proclamation? Could God reveal Himself in another capacity? Absolutely, He could. Would I go as far as say that it's necessary and required? No, I think that we can have an informed perspective when it comes to technology and medicine. However, I think that more than another divine proclamation, my challenge would be being more mindful of what the Bible actually says, if we want to work from a Bible perspective. And I think we often limit ourselves. And again, because very often our faith perspective has become a political agenda. And so I think a lot of times, for example, I have a friend who's Mennonite, and he's in eastern Pennsylvania near Philadelphia. And he said, you know, what's really interesting, in a traditional evangelical area, you have someone who very often is pro-death penalty, pro-life when it comes to abortion, and these lists of that. He said, I can caricature what a pretty typical evangelical Republican is, and he went off and ticked off the boxes that most people would approve of. He said, what's interesting in his Mennonite community, partly because it's urban, but partly because Mennonite they weren't formed the same way that evangelicals are, that he said the dots don't connect in the same way. And so it's much more complex. And not to say that Mennonites are right, evangelicals are wrong. That's not the point. But just to allow that there are different ways to interpret things and different voices that could speak into this. And so I think the value becomes, I would challenge us before, and I know this isn't what you're saying, but thinking, wouldn't it be great if God just had some kind of mandate about fill in the blank? Maybe the first step would be that we listen to people with a different faith position, because there may be people who even work within a Christian perspective that might be able to give me insight here that I've just never considered before. And so maybe within my circle and my community, God has already provided a perspective that could help me. I'm so tuned in to believing that what I've been taught and believe is the only way. And that's where I'd still think that might be more the culture informing our faith. But when we begin to let faith inform our culture, then I think we're more open, not necessarily to the conclusions, but there's no violation of my faith to talk to anybody. I am not guilty by association from the people I spend time with to the conversations that I have. And I came from an environment where it was very often just the conclusion of, well, you don't want to be seen with, but that's a cultural assumption, not necessarily a biblical one. So, but I think it's a great question, the in the world, the of the world, and how do we clarify what God may be telling us in 2018, 19, and beyond? And I think the first step would be making sure that we have in our circle, similar answer to a different question, folks that might come from a similar faith perspective in a Christian camp, but may represent different voices and different understanding that might be able to give us perspectives we haven't gotten before. Yeah. Who wants to bring it home? Just because you're in the dark, I can still see you back there. Yeah.